My sister-in-law and her lazy husband who plays video games all day want my house, but things don't end well for them when they do something to my dog. My in-laws have a very toxic relationship with my husband, and it's starting to affect my life. You see, while growing up, my husband used to be the favorite, the golden child, and his mother was extremely close to him. Jacob has told me that, since his father was often quite busy with work, his mother and he spent a lot of time together. But I've noticed that his sister Sarah isn't treated the same way by my mother-in-law. Although I'm sure my mother-in-law loves both of her children, I've noticed time and again that she favors my husband more. I'm sure my sister-in-law must have felt that growing up, which is why my husband has always tried to fill that role, being a good older brother to her and always being there for her. But the truth is, both my sister-in-law and mother-in-law sometimes behave in such absurd ways that they cross the line. For example, when we started dating, Jacob, who was still a recent college graduate at the time, and my in-laws, including Sarah, all lived in the same house. My in-laws had given my husband an entirely separate floor so he could have his own privacy and invite whomever he wanted. Because of that, he would sometimes invite me over to his house to spend the night with him. However, on several occasions in the morning, my sister-in-law would enter our room while we were sleeping without knocking. As you can imagine, sometimes we weren't even properly dressed. But she acted as if it were completely normal and started talking to Jacob about very random things. This was extremely strange to me, as I felt uncomfortable with her seeing me in my underwear. Before anyone points it out, I completely understand that Jacob lived with his family at the time, so I should have expected this. But is knocking on the door before entering a room really too much to ask? I suppose siblings can sometimes be very close, but she and I didn't know each other that well when Jacob and I started dating, so I found her behavior extremely disrespectful. Naturally, I talked to Jacob about it and told him I wouldn't come over again unless he put a lock on the door. He agreed, but as you can imagine, my sister-in-law, who tried to barge into the door the next morning without success, started yelling at us about why we had the door locked. She started shaking and banging on the door, asking her brother to let her in. Finally, Jacob let her in, and she stormed into the room, questioning why he had installed the lock in the first place. When she noticed me, she pointed and started yelling at him, saying it was because of this hussy. I was shocked to hear how rude and derogatory she sounded. Jacob told her that he was the one who wanted to install the lock on the door, but my sister-in-law wasn't convinced. Angrily, she told him they were siblings and shouldn't have secrets between them. Jacob told her he had no secrets and had installed the lock so she wouldn't barge in while we were sleeping, as it was really disturbing. Upon hearing this, my sister-in-law turned her head toward me and yelled that it was all my fault and that I was interfering between her and her brother. This all seemed too much for me, as I am very non-confrontational, so I excused myself to go to the bathroom. I could hear her continuing to yell and Jacob trying to calm her down. When she finally left, he came to comfort me. He apologized for her behavior and assured me that he would talk to her again so she would also apologize to me. The next weekend when I came over, she apologized to me and gave me a very pathetic excuse that she needed to talk to Jacob urgently about something, so she thought it would be okay to enter. Jacob firmly asked her not to bother us again, and she nodded timidly. Although this issue was resolved, this was not her only strange behavior towards Jacob. If Jacob and I disagreed on something, even small things like movies, and if my sister-in-law was around, she would start telling him how he should date someone who had similar tastes to his and that we were clearly not right for each other. Jacob would give her a disapproving look, but she would just smile. Another incident was when she would ask me uncomfortable questions about my past, trying to pry into my life. Jacob and I had been honest about each other's past from the beginning, but I didn't feel comfortable sharing it with his sister. But despite my feelings, she would ask me uncomfortable questions like, "Why did your ex break up with you? Weren't you good enough for him?" Or she would make comments like, "My brother's ex-girlfriend was much prettier than you." All these questions and comments happened when she and I were alone. I slowly began to suspect that she was trying to play this game with me and belittle me. Initially, I stayed quiet, but after several days of it continuing, one day I had enough. I responded to her taunts by saying how I preferred my ex-boyfriend's family more than Jacob's family, as my ex-boyfriend didn't have nosy and overbearing relatives. My sister-in-law seemed shocked by my reaction, and this shut her up for a while. What I said was basically true. Although my sister-in-law had a strange relationship with my husband, my mother-in-law was no better than her. When I first entered their lives, my mother-in-law ignored me. But once she realized Jacob and I were getting serious, she started acting as if I was trying to steal her son. She would purposely ignore me at dinner or during family gatherings and act as if I didn't exist. Sometimes Jacob would notice this and try to talk to her about it, but she never changed. My mother-in-law even once called me spoiled and entitled, just because my parents sent me to a private school and she was a public school teacher. I even know that she tried to convince Jacob not to marry me and told him to keep looking for a better match than me. Thankfully, my husband didn't care about her opinion and proposed to me anyway. When my mother-in-law and sister-in-law found out he had proposed to me, they went crazy. They both called me to tell me that maybe this was a bad decision, and since Jacob wouldn't listen to them, I should end the relationship and give the ring back. I found this very strange and refused, telling them they were crossing a line by asking me something like that, when I loved Jacob and wanted to spend the rest of my life with him. When they realized they couldn't convince me, my mother-in-law changed her tone and reluctantly told me I should do my best to be the best wife for him and take care of him the same way she had taken care of him all these years. I felt a little offended, but tried not to be too offended by her words. Sarah, on the other hand, told me I was clearly just a gold digger and that her brother deserved someone of his status. Which was funny, because at one point it was a problem that I went to private schools, and now I didn't have enough status for him. She was unhinged. She threatened to make sure to expose me before our wedding, so that Jacob would never marry me. After this conversation, I immediately talked to Jacob about everything, and he was shocked at how rude they had been to me. He argued with them about it, but both my mother-in-law and sister-in-law remained firm in their opinion that I wasn't good enough for him. He told me to ignore them, and that he loved me regardless of what they thought. Although his words were comforting, I felt bad that his own family didn't accept me. Jacob and I had already decided to pay for our own wedding, so when my mother-in-law offered to pay for half of our expenses, we politely declined, with Jacob telling her how hard we had worked to save money just for this occasion. Instead of being happy for us, this made her even more upset, and she started telling Jacob how sad she was that he no longer needed her. But Jacob's father seemed to be very proud of us. Unlike his sister and mother, his father was pretty laid back and never had any issues with our relationship. Since my mother-in-law kept complaining to Jacob, we reached a compromise by telling her that we would love for her to organize the rehearsal dinner for us. She agreed, and we tried to let that bring peace. However, as the wedding approached, things took an unexpected turn. The first incident was when my sister-in-law invited herself over for dinner with us, telling Jacob how much she missed him. At that time, Jacob and I were already living alone after our engagement, so we thought she really wanted to spend time with her brother, and we agreed. Jacob clearly asked me if I was okay with having dinner with her, and I reluctantly agreed, as I didn't want to be rude to my sister-in-law, who was soon to be part of my family. While we were enjoying a good meal, my sister-in-law, apparently out of nowhere, started talking about how she absolutely despised cheaters and how unfaithful people were worth nothing. We looked at her curiously, wondering where she was going with this, when my sister-in-law looked me straight in the face and asked how it felt to be worth nothing. My eyebrows furrowed in confusion, and then my sister-in-law began yelling, accusing me of having an affair with my coworker, Zach. Jacob asked her what she meant by that, and my sister-in-law triumphantly started pulling out pictures of me with one of my coworkers, waving them around and insisting that she had caught me red-handed. I already knew that I had never been unfaithful to Jacob since we started dating, so I was also curious about why she thought I was having an affair with my coworker. Looking at the pictures, they seemed quite harmless. It's true that Zach and I were close coworkers, but only because we both started at the company at the same time and helped each other out whenever we made mistakes to avoid getting scolded by our boss later. Zach even had a girlfriend, and Jacob knew about it. I don't have any lock on my phone and had always been pretty open with Jacob about all my coworkers. These casual moments captured in the photos were twisted by my sister-in-law into something they were not, evidence of an imaginary affair. In reality, it was far from her unfounded accusations, and I felt a surge of annoyance at her attempts to tarnish my integrity and strain my relationship with Jacob. Before I could speak to defend myself, Jacob, surprised and visibly upset, stepped in for me. He asked my sister-in-law why she was following me around and taking pictures of me with my coworkers in various public places without anyone's consent. Upon hearing this, my sister-in-law started justifying that she just wanted to investigate me since I wasn't of her status, and she was afraid I was marrying him for his money. Jacob firmly told her that her claims were baseless and that she was creating unnecessary drama out of nothing. He tried to reason with her, asking her to stop spreading lies and trying to harm our relationship, but my sister-in-law kept yelling at him to open his eyes to the obvious affair that was happening. I also tried to tell her that we were just co-workers, but she clung vehemently to her claims. The atmosphere became tense as her accusations escalated. I had had enough of her accusations and yelling, so I told my sister-in-law that I was going to file a police report against her for taking my photos illegally and stalking me. Her expression froze as she looked at me and asked if I was serious. I told her that I clearly had all the evidence and that she had intentionally followed and taken these photos of me with my co-workers without my consent and was trying to defame me with ridiculous lies. My sister-in-law asked me what I wanted, and I told her that I wouldn't file a report against her as long as she stayed out of my life. At this point, there was nothing my sister-in-law could do to escape this situation. She looked at her brother, but Jacob stood by me and told her that she should be grateful that I was willing to let it go, as what she had done was clearly wrong. She reluctantly agreed to stay away from me, and from that day on, she and I haven't spoken. Jacob still has a relationship with her, but she has never dared to talk to me again after that. Now, the second incident that happened before our wedding was the night before the wedding during our rehearsal dinner. My mother-in-law had insisted on taking responsibility for our rehearsal dinner, declining our offer to help her in any way before the event and telling us that she would take care of it. However, upon arrival, it was clear that the preparations were not what we expected. The rehearsal dinner turned out to be a collection of plastic tablecloths on picnic tables and cold Mexican food. During the dinner, she kept acting annoyed, making the whole celebration feel a bit strange. She got drunk and started behaving inappropriately with the other guests, saying she couldn't wait for the wedding stuff to be over and how stressful it had been, even though she hadn't contributed financially or to the planning. Eventually, my father-in-law got angry too and took her out. My sister-in-law tried to protest, trying to justify her mother's behavior, but my father-in-law refused to listen. As you can imagine, it was a complete disaster, and I started panicking, thinking that these two women would somehow ruin my wedding the next day. That night, Jacob and I had our first fight. I firmly told him that he needed to uninvite both my sister-in-law and mother-in-law, as clearly, with the way they were behaving, they would definitely do something to overshadow us during the wedding. My husband vehemently refused and tried to reassure me that his father would be there and wouldn't let them get away with it. So I had to threaten Jacob that if he didn't uninvite his mother and sister, there would be no wedding the next day. Jacob was visibly shocked by my demand, as he knew exactly how it sounded, but I was anxious thinking about what these women might be plotting. I didn't want to be embarrassed in front of my family and friends on my wedding day. Jacob clearly didn't have strong boundaries, but I hoped that with this final decision, he would understand how much they were starting to affect our relationship. Fortunately, Jacob understood and made the right decision. He called his father early in the morning and informed him that his mother and sister were uninvited. My father-in-law didn't even seem surprised and assured him that he would make sure my mother-in-law and sister-in-law didn't show up uninvited. After a few moments of our conversation with my father-in-law, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law started calling Jacob continuously, clearly to convince him to let them come to his wedding. But Jacob firmly told them that after how they had treated me during our relationship, he didn't feel comfortable having them at the wedding. Upon hearing this, my mother-in-law started telling him how bad I was for coming between him and his mother, and my sister-in-law also tried to reason with him. But Jacob stood firm in his decision. I felt bad that my father-in-law couldn't come to our wedding because of his wife and daughter, and believe me, I felt horrible for my ultimatum. But all my feelings of guilt went down the drain when I later found out from some of Jacob's cousins that my sister-in-law and mother-in-law had planned to wear white dresses to our wedding. They told me how they had a family WhatsApp group that only had female members, and in this group, my sister-in-law encouraged others to wear white too, saying that there was no reason why the bride should be the only one wearing white. I was stunned by how low they could go to hurt me. After finding this out, I was glad they were uninvited. Jacob missed his family, but he also understood where I was coming from. Overall, we had a great wedding, and no one tried to overshadow us. But since that day, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law stopped talking to me altogether, which made me very happy, and I was perfectly comfortable with it. They would only invite my husband to dinner or for special occasions, which didn't bother me too much. My father-in-law, on the other hand, was kind to me, and we kept in touch over the years. Jacob and I meticulously saved our money and eventually bought a new house this year. It's our first house, and as you can imagine, we were very excited to finally own something so significant. His parents and my sister-in-law came to visit our place for a small housewarming celebration, and that day, to avoid them, I visited my parents and spent time with my family. Now, getting to the main issue. Last month, out of the blue, my mother-in-law called me. This was very unexpected, as she and I had never spoken since the day I married Jacob. Surprisingly, she casually asked how I had been and how my life was going. I was a bit taken aback by her sudden interest, but I answered her questions anyway. Then she started asking how it felt to live in such a big house when it was just Jacob and me. Her words hurt me because Jacob and I had been wanting to get pregnant for a long time, but due to some infertility issues, I couldn't conceive. Jacob knew this, and although we lamented that we might never be able to have our own children, we eventually accepted it. He loved me and told me it was okay if we didn't have kids as long as we had each other. Obviously, our families knew this too, which is why my mother-in-law made subtle comments about it. Then she went on to inform me that my sister-in-law was pregnant. I was shocked to hear this, as this would be her 6th child. I had heard from Jacob that her husband was unemployed and didn't believe in using condoms, leading to these accidental pregnancies. My sister-in-law's partner was the epitome of laziness and did nothing around the house to help her or the kids. I've heard from Jacob that he treats my sister-in-law like his personal maid. He doesn't even pay the household bills. My sister-in-law works several part-time jobs while he spends all day playing. Despite how much everyone has talked to her, my sister-in-law never leaves him. My mother-in-law then continued saying that since my sister-in-law could no longer afford to keep working during her pregnancy, she thought it would be a good idea for Jacob and me to give up our place since it was too big for a childless couple like us. I was shocked by her demand and struggled to find words. I asked if she was joking, but my mother-in-law continued, saying she was, in fact, being very serious, and that my sister-in-law and her husband deserved to live in a bigger house. But since she had no room in her own house to let them move in, she had asked them to move in with us. The weight of this announcement hung in the air, and I found myself trying to compose a response amidst the whirlwind of emotions now engulfing me. I explained how this was our house, which we were still paying for. The idea of someone else moving in with us so abruptly without even asking our permission was intrusive and ridiculous. However, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law emphasized that they had already talked to Jacob and that he had agreed to this. This seemed strange, as Jacob and I always shared everything with each other, and I knew for sure that he would have definitely told me the news if he had agreed to let his sister and her family stay with us. I told my mother-in-law firmly that since the house belonged to both Jacob and me, he couldn't give permission alone without my consent. No one could live here with us unless we both agreed. To compromise, I said I'd be happy to host my sister-in-law and her husband for a few days if that's what they wanted, but I wouldn't allow them to move in with me. My mother-in-law, on the other hand, began shouting at me that making space for my sister-in-law and her husband was expected of me as an obedient daughter-in-law, and if I agreed to her demands, all our past issues would be forgiven. So, angrily, I responded, "Sure, I'll be happy to let them have our home, but look, we're still paying for this place, and I know that if my sister-in-law and her husband move in, they won't help with the mortgage or the bills. Therefore, I think you should take some responsibility and help pay for my sister-in-law, her husband, and their kids to live in our house. I'll be happy if you can just pay the mortgage for us, and we can cover everyone's bills. I know you won't be able to pay the mortgage with the only job you have, so tell me, when are you going to get a second job to pay the debt?" My mother-in-law, upon hearing this, exploded in a fit of rage, yelling and expressing her displeasure. She told me it was ridiculous to ask her to pay the mortgage for us, and I replied that it was equally ridiculous to expect us to take care of my sister-in-law's family and let them move in. This infuriated her even more, and she kept shouting while I smiled in satisfaction. She hung up the call when she realized I wasn't going to give in to her demands. Shortly after, my sister-in-law called, yelling at me for daring to ask her mother to pay our mortgage. She went on saying how she had always known that I was just a gold digger, and I told her that she was the gold digger for trying to live with us. And if she ever wanted to see who the real gold digger in the family was, then she needed to look at her own partner, who did nothing to help her. This seemed to silence her. I told her firmly that she could argue with me all she wanted, but I would never allow her family to move into our house unless they were willing to help us with our mortgage. She accused me of being heartless and prioritizing money over family. Update 1. Thanks to everyone who has given me support. To answer the biggest question everyone keeps asking, why would my mother-in-law demand something so ridiculous from us? It's because my mother-in-law has always been this arrogant. Clearly, my husband has allowed this farce to go on for too long, and he and I need to sit down and have a serious conversation about it. It's pathetic how my mother-in-law can lie about her own son just to get her way. My sister-in-law is just a pawn in her game, who does what her mom wants because my mother-in-law has always favored my husband. My sister-in-law simply follows what her mom says in the hopes that my mother-in-law will favor her too. In this case, my sister-in-law would benefit from this situation since she could depend on us to pay her bills and take care of her kids while her useless husband does nothing. I'm waiting for my husband to return from his business trip so we can talk. I don't want to discuss this over the phone with him as it's too important. Update 2. It's been 3 days since my last update. As I mentioned earlier, I was waiting for my husband to return so we could finally sit down and talk. When he got back and we finally had a chance to talk, I told him about how his mother had called me, demanding that we give up our house for his sister and her family. Jacob was clearly shocked to hear this, and I went on to tell him the whole story. Then he confessed that he had no idea about any of this, and that the only thing his mother had told him before he left for the trip was that his sister was pregnant. That's all he knew about the situation, and he had no idea she would make such ridiculous demands. I firmly told him that I expected him to talk to my mother-in-law about it and handle the situation since I couldn't deal with his family, and he agreed. He called my mother-in-law in front of me and asked why she had lied to me about him. Caught in her lie, my mother-in-law tried to backtrack, saying she hadn't exactly lied and that she knew he wouldn't have any problem with his sister living with us. So she had decided to take matters into her own hands and ask me directly. Jacob stopped her in her tracks and asked why she assumed he wouldn't have any problem with my sister-in-law and her entire family moving in. My mother-in-law told him that he and my sister-in-law were close, so obviously that meant he would be happy to help her by letting her family move in. Hearing this, I closed my eyes in frustration, but kept my mouth shut since Jacob needed to handle his mother. My husband then firmly told her that there was no way he was going to allow my sister-in-law, her unemployed husband, and their 6 children to move in with us, and that she had no right to force us to take care of them. My mother-in-law started yelling that my sister-in-law really needed someone right now. But my husband told her that it wasn't our responsibility, and if she wanted, then she should take care of my sister-in-law. She then started saying that my father-in-law didn't want that and that her house was too small, but we were living in such a huge house so we could easily help her out. She even went so far as to say that since I was sterile anyway, I could help take care of my sister-in-law's kids, and this would make me feel fulfilled. My eyes widened in shock, but for the first time, I saw my husband's face change color. He shouted at her that she had no right to say something so insensitive about me and that she couldn't use that against me to force me to take care of my sister-in-law's kids. He continued telling her that my father-in-law was right in not wanting anything to do with my sister-in-law since she had become a baby-making machine and that he was done with both of them. My mother-in-law tried to back down, but Jacob continued to yell at her that this was our house and I was his wife, and anyone who disrespected me was also disrespecting him and didn't deserve to stay in his life. With those final words, Jacob hung up the call. Since then, he has had no contact with my sister-in-law or my mother-in-law. My father-in-law did call to speak with him, but after learning about the whole incident, he completely understood why Jacob had made such a drastic decision. My father-in-law spoke and apologized to me on behalf of his wife, but I told him it wasn't his fault anyway. Update 3. It's been an interesting few weeks. Many people suggested that I install cameras around my house in case my mother-in-law and sister-in-law decided to show up and cause a scene, so I did. I ordered them online and installed several around my home. Well, fortunately, they decided to show up last weekend, knocking on my door while I was completely alone. When I saw they were there from my camera, I immediately called Jacob, and he said he was on his way. When I opened the door, there they were, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law, looking at me angrily. They demanded to be let in, but I stood my ground, refusing to allow them entry and telling them that if they had something to discuss, they could do so from outside. My mother-in-law started shouting about how ruthless I was, accusing me of being greedy and selfish. I calmly told her that this was our house and that they had no right to barge in uninvited. My mother-in-law continued, not realizing that the cameras were capturing every moment. I calmly reminded her of our previous conversation, reiterating that I was not going to give up my home for my sister-in-law and her husband, and that if she had anything more to discuss, she would have to wait for Jacob to get home. My sister-in-law, for her part, started yelling that I was breaking up the family for no reason and that I was being too stubborn. She told me that I was not just a gold digger as she had always known, but now I was trying to keep her brother away from them. So, I informed them that everything they were saying was being recorded by our cameras, and that I would use this evidence to obtain a restraining order against them so that next time they could not come within 100 meters of our house. Their eyes widened in shock, and my mother-in-law screamed that I wouldn't dare do that. I smiled maliciously and told her that if they didn't leave our property at that very moment, she would receive a legal order very soon. This frightened them, and my sister-in-law started saying that I was overreacting and it wasn't a big deal. Fortunately, at that moment, Jacob arrived. He approached us calmly and asked my mother-in-law what they were doing there. My mother-in-law rushed to hug him, but he dodged her and asked her again firmly what she and my sister-in-law were doing there. My sister-in-law began to say that they knew it was me trying to control their lives by not letting them speak with him, and that they had come to confront me. I rolled my eyes at how absurd they sounded. Jacob clarified to both of them that he was the one who made the decision to cut off contact and that he wanted nothing to do with either of them. At this point, my mother-in-law started begging him to forgive her, but he simply told them to leave the property or he would have no choice but to call the police. Their eyes widened in shock. Clearly, neither of them had expected this reaction from him. Jacob continued to tell them that if they showed up at our house again, he and I would be free to call the police and have them removed by force. They looked devastated, but Jacob no longer cared. I was relieved that my husband was finally standing up for me. Eventually, they left, still furious. Since then, Jacob has also spoken with my father-in-law, who was as surprised as we were that my mother-in-law and sister-in-law had shown up at our house unannounced. He assured us that we did the right thing by not letting them in, and he is also increasingly frustrated with their behavior. With Jacob being so firm about it and sending them away, I'm confident they won't dare to step foot on our property again. If they do, well, I'll contact a lawyer and get a restraining order immediately. I'm glad my husband has finally realized how toxic his family is, and I hope they no longer bother us so that we can live our lives in peace. I hope this will be my last update as I want to move on from this situation. Update 4. I was hoping my last update would be final, but unfortunately it wasn't. I have a lot to share. Jacob and I went on vacation a few weeks ago, and while we were away from home, my sister-in-law broke into my house. Basically, they broke a back window and then changed the locks and everything. We didn't have an alarm system per se, but we did have the cameras we had installed. We had left our dog with one of those systems that fills his food and water bowl periodically, and a friend visited him every other day to check on him. So, I decided to check what was happening using the cameras from my phone. My heart raced when I saw my sister-in-law and her children with her husband, who was playing video games in my living room in his underwear. The worst part was that I didn't see my dog, and it was because they had kicked him out. He had a back door to go out into the backyard, but they let him out the front, and he left, not without being mistreated to make him go. So, I showed Jacob, and we decided to cut our vacation short. The trip was about 5 hours, but an hour before we arrived, we called the police. By the time we arrived, there were a couple of patrol cars, and they were at the door talking to my sister-in-law. Immediately we explained that this was our house and that these people had no right to be there. So one of the officers called Child Protective Services, and they took the children away, while my sister-in-law and her husband were arrested. During that time, which lasted several hours, my mother-in-law showed up. I started reviewing the previous recordings from the security cameras and saw that she was also there the day before with them. So the police also took her away, considering her a sort of accomplice. In summary, they didn't spend too much time in jail, but were considering taking legal action against them. First, restraining orders, and then some sort of lawsuit for damages as they changed locks, broke some things inside, and also caused us to lose some days of our vacation. I'll update you when I have more news about all this, although it won't be soon. Update 5. Well, the restraining orders are now in place and they cannot come within 100 meters of us and the house. They also lost a judgment for $7,500 for damages and other issues that my sister-in-law and her husband have to pay. But since they don't have much, they'll probably ask my mother-in-law for it. Many asked me about my dog in the last update, as I didn't end up commenting on what happened to him. Fortunately, he just went to a neighbor's house, who took care of him until we arrived. He was just a bit scared because of how they treated him to make him leave, but that was all. He was very happy to see us. My father-in-law is also tired of my mother-in-law, so he is thinking of asking for a divorce. But whether that happens or not is no longer my concern, so I don't think I'll be updating on that.